Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Last week, in part one of my interview with Steve Patterson, Steve argued against academic philosophy. Today we're diving into his ideas on logic and existence. Although this is a part two, you should be able to follow it entirely even if you haven't listened to part one. If you do want to hear part one, however, you can find it, as always, at williamnava.com. Your book, Square One, sets itself out on a kind of quest for certainty.
Yeah.
And so I want to dive into that. I feel like heard many arguments for that kind of certainty, and I'm still not convinced. So I'd like to discuss some of the stuff in your books. Let me start by asking you, why is this idea of 100% foolproof certainty so important? Yeah, start there.
Okay, so as I discovered by being wrong, fundamentally wrong in my belief system, the further you go down in your worldview, the more fundamental ideas, little errors just ruin the whole thing. Like if the root of your tree has a cancer, the whole tree is going to die. It doesn't matter how pretty the leaves and the branches and the trunk are. So the idea is, if it's the case that there is any roots that we can find anywhere in which we can be certain of, that's the ideas you want to build from. So if there's any possibility of being wrong about your fundamentals, well, that's a big deal. You better know whether or not it's the case that, you're building on sound fundamentals or not sound fundamentals, or whether you can even have sound fundamentals. But if they can be discovered, then those are the building blocks on which you can, piece by piece, build your structure of knowledge. And so that's kind of, I would say, and the book explains, you can discover a limited set of certain beliefs, and you can build from there.
Right. Yeah, and I think that though the idea of absolute 100% certainty doesn't seem especially important to me, but that's, I think, in part because I've sort of believed that it's not really attainable, and yet I do think that very high levels of credence are attainable. But I suppose it seems fairly obvious that if you can attain absolute certainty, then certainly go for that one. So let's talk about that. There are, obviously many famous arguments for skepticism, or actually, let's not even say for skepticism. Let's say, arguments for allowing doubt to enter the picture. Descartes had a lot of famous ones. Even though, of course, he eventually decides that there's something he discovered that he didn't doubt. He had all these famous arguments for why we might doubt. And the one I like to go to as a kind of starting point is the Agrippan Trilemma, sometimes called the Münhhausen Trilemma, which is this idea of that in order to know something, you're going to need some kind of justification in order to claim to base your claim of knowledge on. So say I believe X, like X is true, and I'm sure of it. You have to kind of ask, why are you so sure? And then you must respond with something, right? With some why. Because of why, I can be sure of X. And then then you can ask, well, why are you so sure of Y? Well, I need to justify it, so I need to give you Z. And so, like, this regress kind of proposes itself.
Yeah.
And the way that people have usually diagnosed that problem is to say, well, look, you have three ways out, other than just acknowledging that you can't know things. One is to somehow accept that you can just go on an infinite regress, and yet somehow that still be knowledge. And that's a very unpopular view.
Especially for me.
Then there's, of course, coherentism, which tries to make sense of the idea that you could have X justified by Y and Y justified by X. So that there's no actual grounding, there's just a sort of loop. And then there's foundationalism, which basically says there are bottom level beliefs, and these bottom level beliefs are in some way don't need justification like others do. And then there's kind of, you have to kind of answer, well, why is that? Are they self-evident, or are they whatever? So given that you have a claim to certainty, what path do you take, or do you take a different path? How do you deal with this, with this problem?
It's pretty straightforward, and I guess if I had to play the taxonomy game, I would be a foundationalist, even though formally I probably might disagree with them on some things. There's a difference between contingent propositions and necessary propositions. And the problem goes away when you just understand that some things are necessary. What necessarily true means is that it is not contingent. So to ask why is something that is necessarily true is to not think about what necessarily true means. It's necessarily true because that's what we mean by the term. So prime candidates would be basic propositions in mathematics and logic. So everything is exactly the way that it is. Well, why is that true? Well, if you think about it, things are what they are. If they weren't the way that they are, they would be some other way. Since they aren't some other way, they are exactly the way that they are, and it couldn't be otherwise. So there's simply a difference between most ideas, which are contingent propositions, and some ones which are foundational or necessary propositions.
So my response to that, kind of coming from the again somewhat skeptical perspective, I'm putting skeptical in scare quotes because I'm calling into doubt levels of certainty. I'm not actually saying we can't know anything. I want to be clear about that. But my response is that there's a bit of a conflation between the epistemological question and the metaphysical questions there. And here's what I mean by that. Presumably, let's say that there's some truth that is a necessary truth, not a contingent truth. Let's say, for example, that all dogs are dogs is a necessary truth, not a contingent truth, right? Then presumably that's always been the case, whether or not anybody knew it, whether or not anybody believes it, knows it, or has justification for it. And so the idea...
I think that's kind of a weird way of putting it. So that's a very Platonic way of thinking about how language works. I don't think to say all dogs are dogs is true even before there were humans. I don't actually think language works that way. I think that's something that you say at present, and that is true at present. If you were to say at some other unique point in time, all dogs are dogs, that would also be true. But this idea of the kind of the cosmic sentence, I don't think that language does that.
Is there a necessary truth that you would be happy to use as an example that you think would be true even if nobody knew it?
So this is where I like to distinguish between linguistic truth and metaphysical truth. So linguistic truth is sentences that make claims about metaphysical truth. Metaphysical truth is the way that things actually are. So with no humans, if there were no minds, you would have no linguistic truth, you'd have no propositions, but things would still be the way they are themselves. So to say, is there a proposition that if there were nobody, it would still be true is kind of a weird way. I would say that even without our describing things some particular way, things still are the way that they are. Yeah.
So the point about the difference between linguistic and metaphysics is well taken, and it's something I'll probably want to come back to at some point. But so I think what I'm trying to get at is that the question of certain knowledge is different from the question of necessary truth, in the sense that one is an epistemic question. In other words, it's a question about my relationship to the fact, as in, can I actually be sure of them? So it's about how my mind might relate to those facts. Whereas the issue about is this a necessary fact is a question about about the status of that fact, independent of how I might discover it, know it, believe it, or any of that.
Yeah, I think that presupposes a certain way that language works. I don't think language works that way. So I don't. the idea of the mind-independent world is something that I'm open to being a solipsist. I'm not a solipsist, but I'm open to that being the case. And if that's the case, then it also changes how we think language works. So yeah, even the way that you're kind of splitting between the metaphysics and the epistemology, that's a very standard way of thinking about metaphysics and epistemology. But I've got a line in my book where I say at the bottom of everything, metaphysics and epistemology blend together. And the claim that logic and existence are inseparable is both a metaphysical and an epistemological claim. And a side note, this is also a good example where in square one, that's a claim that very few people are going to deal with, and exactly what I mean by that and how deep maybe that goes. But it's packed in a book which anybody can read. Most of square one is like really easy, light reading. It's like kind of the big funnel idea. Mm-hmm. But even packed in the middle of that, and especially in chapters 3 and 4, it goes all the way down to what I consider to be the most fundamental question of all philosophies. Just want to make that side note.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true that square one is both very accessible and easy to read, and tackles absolute very fundamental questions. So maybe we just we might just kind of disagree on this point and we can move on. But let me kind of push back for a moment, because even I don't think that you said maybe you're open to the idea of being a solipsist, and my intuition tells me that whether you happen to be a solipsist or an idealist or whatever, it's probably not going to really matter to this difference between an epistemological question and a metaphysical question. Because let's say that go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting thought. So if it's the case that everything that exists is what exists in my mind right now, then could it be the case that there is a distinction between my possessing of knowledge and my possessing of knowledge of the thing as it exists?
Well, what I'm saying is, could there be a difference between your knowing something versus something being the case, even though that being the case is just in your mind? Like even, let's just take for granted idealism for the moment, even though neither of us is quite convinced of it.
Yeah. No, I actually don't think there's a distinction. So then the objects that exist in the world would be your mental states and your claims to knowledge. So I don't see really a distinction between epistemology and metaphysics in that circumstance, right? So my belief that X is a statement about what exists it is the thing that exists in the world. There is no external referent to knowledge in that circumstance.
So do you think that everything in your mind, simply by virtue of it being in your mind, you must know?
It is the case certainty. So it is the case that the mind is very broad, but you could say that what I like to say is the contents of my experience are certainly taking place in the way that they are. So I don't know if the contents of my experience correlate to an external world. I don't have that. I don't have a certain connection between the mind and the world. I have a theorized one, but it's not a certain one. But if I were to say, for example, that let's see, there's a good pencil example, right? If I were to say there is a pencil in my hand, well, if we're going to be super philosophically rigorous, what I think you can certainly say is there is an experience of pink taking place, or even more precise, in my own personal language, what I mean by pink is taking place, which is probably something different than what you might be by pink. So you got to go really far. You got to talk about the philosophy of language if we're going to get down to the fundamentals. But I don't think I could be wrong about that. I might be wrong about my theorized explanation for the cause of my experience, but not the actual mental object itself. So in that circumstance, there's a metaphysical truth that I have perfect epistemological certainty about. That it is the case that pinkness is taking place right now.
So let me take most of that for granted and ask you this question.
Okay.
If let's say that, again, I grant the sort of philosophy of language point that the what you consider to be a pink pencil within your experience right now,
right.
All of those sort of disclaimers that you'd have to put in. Let me sort of just grant them.
Okay.
You don't think that there would be a difference between that being the case, the fact that that is your experience in that way that you're experiencing it, and your knowing that. You don't think that your knowing it involves something extra, like a relationship of belief about and certainty about that the thing itself is just raw experience it doesn't have?
No, because when you're thinking about it, that is your experience. You still experience thought. You still experience language. There's no separation between the two.
Well, yeah, I mean,
there might be a chronological separation. So there might be the experience and then the next instant of the experience of thinking and saying things. But in that case, the experience has changed. So no, I don't think there's a distinction there in that very weird circumstance that neither of us believe.
Right. Yeah. So what I would want to say, I don't think I fully disagree with the general point you made, but I would still want to say that let's say that there's the experience of the pencil. I wish I had a pink pencil so I could do the same thing. I have a red and white one.
Okay. All right.
So if I would want to say, if there is that experience, right, and it is exactly whatever it is, and that might be necessarily so, my knowing that would be a separate experience. It would be the experience of me knowing that. That would itself also be an experience, but what that experience is the experience of knowing this, whereas this original thing was not an experience of knowing. It was just an experience of appearance of whatever sense data or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so there's a chronological distinction there, but I don't think there's a different ontological distinction. So it's both experience. One is the experience of the visual sense data or the focusing on the visual sense data. The other would be an experience of focusing on your conceptual experience. But so I mean, there is a difference there, I guess, but I would say it's a chronological one and not like a fundamental one. Now, I would also say, in my actual worldview, there is definitely a distinction between, right? So I'm like a pluralist. I think there are many different systems. I was a reluctant dualist for a long time, but then I'm like a pluralist now. So I do think there is the physical system, there is a perceptual system, there's a conceptual system. I do think there's all kinds of distinctions between these things, but I don't think that's logically necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think where I suppose I disagree is that I think that knowledge, just by how it is that people have used the term, has to involve this idea of justification, and whereas a simple experience of sense perception doesn't. And so that's what makes them, to me, fundamentally different. They're both just experiences, but one is an experience of a perception, and one is an experience of this, what people call an intentional attitude, right? An attitude of knowledge or of belief. And that one involves this component of justification, whereas the original one is just a thing that happens. I don't even have to have language for me to get some raw perception.
Sure. I would say I think that is true. I definitely have a belief. I don't know it, but I definitely have a belief that there is that kind of separation between the experience and the concept of it. So, for example, if I were to say, if I were to talk about my experiences, I could be wrong if we're talking about chronology. So I could say, 5 seconds ago, I am certain that I had the experience of the pink. Well, no, actually, I'm not certain of that, because maybe it's the case that the universe just came into existence 3 seconds ago, but it came into existence and I already had memories implanted in my brain. So I can't really be certain about that. So, yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's try to. I want to now move this back a little bit to foundationalism, where I think we started getting off into all this. So I guess the reason I went into this whole kind of rabbit hole about the difference between experience and knowledge and all that is I want to get you to say that when it comes to a claim of certainty, you're going to need some justification, even if the thing that you want to claim certainty about is actually necessary and would, and must be metaphysically true. For you to have the relationship of certainty toward it, you have to have this thing call justification, because we're no longer just talking about that fact being necessarily the case. We're talking about you thinking about that fact and going, I'm certain of it. And so that involves this extra thing of justification.
So I actually don't like the term justification here. I think because that's misleading, because it implies, oh, well, maybe you're wrong about it, right? So I think I prefer the term explanation. So if it's the case that I'm certain about a particular set of things, which I say I am certain about a particular set of things, I can explain them using language. But to say that the way that I think most people use justification is it implies you might be wrong, or that it's contingent, or like, let's hear what your justification for X is. And to apply that to logically necessary propositions, I think, is a mistake. You might call them formally. So, for example, you might say, for example, like the justification for the belief, all dogs are dogs. Does that have justification? Well, I'd like to say it has explanation, because things are the way that they are. But I guess you could call it justification. If somebody to say, why do you believe things are things, I would say, well, it's necessary and so on. But it's not like it could be some other way. And I'm giving my best guess as to what's going on here.
Well, let me use a different word. I guess I'm thinking more like grounds for believing, right? So again, it's totally about why you believe the thing, not why the thing is the case. So, for example, somebody might be wrong about a necessary fact. In fact, I'm sure that there are things that you would say are necessary facts, and I'm wrong about them, right? And so the fact that I'm wrong doesn't impact the fact that that's a necessary fact. That's a necessary fact, whether or not I'm wrong about it. And so that's why I'm trying to make that distinction, is because I want to say that when it comes to belief, whether or not something is necessary, you need grounds. You need to have some kind of this is why I believe this is a necessary fact.
Okay. So maybe this is interesting. So maybe I would say something like this. My grounds are not public, in the sense that it is not the case that if I were to write them out, A is true because B, and C, and blah, 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 blah. That's not how I'm saying A is true because of all these other beliefs. I'm saying A is true, and my grounds is something that is the way my conceptual system works. And so what I would say is, in using language, if you meditate on the meaning of what is meant by the word necessary, you can purely understand why necessary things are necessary. So it's not the case that necessary thing, proposition A is necessary things are necessary. Proposition B is because necessary things are necessary, right? That would be like you're thinking A is true because B is true. I'm saying no. Necessary things are necessary, and if you meditate on what that means, you will understand why necessary things are necessary, and then you'll say, and then we'll be able to articulate with the formal justification and maybe put it in a paper or something. Does that work?
Well, it sounds like what you're saying. I'm going to describe it in different words and tell me if it sounds like approximately the same thing. That certain things are essentially self-evident. They're kind of self-grounded, and the reason that we can say they're self-grounded is difficult, perhaps impossible, to articulate in a way that's going to prove it to you. Like the grounds are totally clear. But if you meditate on it, it will be sort of clear to you that they're in fact self-evidit, whether or not you can describe it or not.
Yes, I kind of like it because because here's why. There's a framing error here. If somebody were to say, Steve, why are necessary things necessary? And I were to think to myself, okay, I have to prove to this person that necessary things are necessary, that would already be a framing error, because that would imply that the person seeking the answer to the question, why are necessary things necessary, doesn't understand what he means by necessary. So my reaction, it's like if I were to, I'm having the experience of yellow. The pencil color has changed now. That doesn't say, we'll be consistent here with the pink pencil color. If let's say I were to have a dialogue with myself, and there's a skeptical Steve and then there's your regular Steve, and the experience of pink is taking place right now, and the skeptical Steve goes, but how do you know? How do you know that there is pinkness taking place right now? If I were to say, if the teacher Steve were to say, oh, well, because if X, Y, and Z, and if I give you some linguistic answer, I kind of missed the point. It's like, that's not what the student needs to learn. The student needs to know pinkness is actually taking place right now, and it is up to you to discover why that is certainly the case. You're not going to find a linguistic answer from somebody else as to why pinkness is taking place right now. But if you meditate on the contents of your experience, you will actually discover that indeed it is so. That is the case with necessary things. I can't give you a linguistic answer why necessary things are necessary. I can say, deeply think about what that word means, and I can try to explain it like I do in Square One, the Foundations of Knowledge. Things are the way they are, and blah, 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 try to build that intuition. And then, ultimately it's up to that person to kind of piece it together themselves.
So I have a bit of a distinction between two kinds of claims to certainty that I've encountered. One is, I think, claims to certainty of the contents of my experience, and that I think is what we've been talking about with the pink pencil. And then there are claims to certainty that are more about self-evident logical truths, like that all dogs are dogs, or maybe some specific instance of the law of non-contradiction, something like that. And it has always seemed to me that the justifications, the stories that go behind why those two kinds of things are certain, tend to usually be fairly different. Would you say that in your case, the two kinds of claims to certainty actually more or less come down to the same thing, or do you admit that kind of a distinction?
There is some distinction. Because this is where we talk about ontology a bit, because we're talking about different metaphysical fields here. So in the one circumstance, if I'm talking about purely the contents of my experience, I cannot say anything about anything outside the contents of my experience. I can't say any true things about anything other than what is taking place right now within the contents of my experience. However, I do think that with logical propositions like all pink experiences are the way that they are, that's not just true about my experience. So already we're packing in a metaphysical assumption that there is something outside of the contents of my experience. So I think in that way, the logical ones are kind of more broad. They're a bit more abstract. They deal with more claims if we assume that solipsism is false. So that's where I see a distinction.
But you would kind of access both by kind of, again, meditating on your experience in that way.
I don't know if I would say meditating on the experience as much as, I guess fundamentally, very, very, very deeply meditating on the contents of your experience to discover, identity. To discover that identity is a real thing, or what we mean when we say A is A, what does that actually mean? That I do think you can discover by meditating on the contents of your experience. But it's really, that's a very personal thing. That's really, I haven't thought about it in that way. So you could kind of think of Square One maybe as a bit of explaining that discovery on the meditating of what my own personal experiences, which I would say is very powerful, because assuming that there is minds outside of my own, they're going to work the same way, and I can even know the way that they work even without accessing them directly. That's how powerful that particular meditation on identity or a necessariness is.
When I've thought about, so I've heard you give this kind of argument before, and you talk a little bit about it in Square One, and when I've thought about it, it has seemed to me like what you're proposing almost is that for these kinds of things that you claim are like sort of logically necessary truths, like A is A or whatever, what you're sort of saying is, if you just close your eyes and really think about the meaning of the words, try to put them together, you're eventually going to realize that if you try to deny it, you're going to hit a kind of block. And it's kind of like, I can't quite tell you what that block is, but if you just do what I'm telling you to do, you're going to feel it. That might not be at all what you're saying, but that's always kind of like the sense that I've gotten from your...
So I guess I'd put it this way. I do think you can identify it. So I think my explanation of contradictions, I guess I would say there is a for somebody that is dealing with these questions, and is still open to the idea of there being, in actuality, a logical contradiction, it is only a reflection of a lack of patience and awareness, is the way that I would put it. It's just like the same thing with the skeptic who is having the experience of pink and saying that maybe I'm not. There is only one explanation for that, which is you're not actually going that deep, which is okay. I mean, and not everybody wakes up realizing the law of identity. This is a long process to get there, but it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like a great secret that, and I think anybody can discover if they think about it in the right mindset with the right tools. And that's why this is such an interesting topic too, because as you go around talking to people about these ideas, there's a very, very large group of people that say it's obvious, it's self-evident, that why even dogs are dogs, like, well, who would possibly deny that? Which is fine. I'm glad that people have that intuition. But there's a whole other group of people that don't have those intuitions. Or if they do, they've kind of, I would say they've been, the clarity of their minds have been smudged a bit. Maybe based on philosophic training, maybe going to the academy, you encounter these ideas, you go, well, if I was wrong about everything else, I got to be wrong about this, or I can't have that kind of certainty because I was wrong there. And they have yet to maybe, they've just lost that clarity of insight. So that book was written also for those people, because it's not, it doesn't have to be, it needs explanation, I would say. It doesn't need justification in this sense, it needs explanation.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, so I'm an example of somebody who, what I think is that, if we were to say an example of the law of non-contradiction, or a violation of the law of non-contradiction, rather, I think there's cases of that where I would claim I understand what's being said, and I think I'm fairly clear on what the implications are. And what the actual meaning is here, and yet I do think there are violations. So I'd like to go down this road with you and kind of and go through that. Yeah. Let's start by taking a step back and talking about logic, because one thing is that from having read your book, I know that you and I have actually somewhat different definitions of what logic is to begin with, and so we want to make sure that we're not just like talking past each other using the word logic differently. In your book, you say a number of things about logic. Most memorably, I think that logic and existence are inseparable. Can you? That claim seems to be very important to you. Can you flesh that claim out?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you for asking. The first person who's asked me specifically about that sentence, and it's like the most important in my whole worldview. Okay, so the question is, can we know anything with certainty? If so, how is that even possible? If we could be wrong about everything, and I was wrong about everything, is there any kind of fundamental knowledge that is indubitable? Because if there isn't, I want to know about it. I want to have the appropriate position on these things. So one of the things that you discover in going down the skeptical line of reasoning is that skepticism itself presupposes a certain number of things. So what skepticism means is that something might be wrong, or that something might not be true. That itself presupposes that truth is something, there's something meaningful to truth. That the concept of truth means something as distinct from something else. So as specifically distinct from falsehood. So if one takes the skeptical approach, you are automatically committing to a kind of idea that there's a meaningful distinction between true and false. If there's no meaningful distinction between true and false, skepticism doesn't mean anything. Now, the difference between true...
Let me stop you there, because I'm with you, and I admit a distinction between true and false. But let me push back on one thing there. What if somebody, again, not my case, but I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate, were to say, well, yeah, I have a kind of skepticism, despite the fact that I don't admit of the concept of true and false, not because I think that, whatever thing you're saying is true, I'm saying is false, and so therefore I must be using those terms, but rather I just refuse to accept whatever it is that you're telling me. It's not like I'm saying it's true or it's false. I'm just by saying it's true are kind of trying to get me to assent to it, and I want nothing to do with it. I'm not saying false. I'm not saying true. I'm just stepping outside the system, and that's maybe not a skepticism in terms of thinking of things as false, but it's a kind of skepticism in that I'm refusing to accept these truths.
So the only consistent practitioners of that belief system, I think, were the cradleists, the Greek cradleists, and they refused to engage in discussion with anybody. They were famously silent. They were beggars on the street. It was kind of a performance art, but they didn't say anything because they essentially made that argument, that non-argument, which is, well, I'm not even going to talk. And that's okay. This is not, so it would be a mistake to try to make an argument for why somebody should listen to arguments. So if somebody is rejecting outright persuasion, open-mindedness, investigation, then I can't persuade. It would be impossible. So I would put it as it's like a fundamental ethical thing or whatever. The pursuing of inquiring about these things. It's kind of like saying, if somebody refuses to learn English, what are you going to tell them in English to convince them? You can't. You've rejected the medium of communication there.
Well, what if this person didn't reject all of discourse, but really just the true-false way of talking? And so they might say, "Look, don't try to convince me. Don't try to convince me that something is true or false. I'll still talk to you, and maybe based on some of the things that you say, I'll do some things, and there will be an actual causal relationship between the fact that you said some things and the fact that I do some things.
Sure.
But I'm not going to be I'm not going to be granting you this was true, this was false."
Yeah. So that would just be a case of somebody not understanding what they presuppose. So if they're engaging whatsoever, then they are presupposing a whole myriad of things. Fundamentally, even that logic and existence are inseparable, but we'll get to that part. But they are presupposing then that you said, if you say some things, I may do some things. That presupposes the law of identity. That presupposes this idea of causality. That presupposes that language is a real thing that is taking place. So there's no. A better analogy than somebody choosing not to speak the same language is if somebody is communicating and saying, I do not have the ability to communicate using language. If somebody vigorously says, hey, you cannot convince me that I can use language. Right? Your reaction or my reaction would be, okay, all that's going on is this person doesn't quite understand what's going on. It's the same thing as staring at the pink and saying, I don't know, maybe I'm not experiencing something. It's like, well, I know that you're using language. Right? You can actually know that you're using language, or that language is a thing. We can make all the proper caveats about what we mean by those terms. But yeah, it's up to that. Like it's kind of like playing chess. Actually, it's very similar to playing chess. Is somebody who knows how to play chess will be able to see very quickly whether or not their opponent knows how to play chess based on how they're moving. Based on how they're moving, you can understand the knowledge that somebody has or kind of their level of development in their chess game. And it's the same thing in this circumstance. If somebody's trying to say anything and at the same time, but I reject the true-false distinction, it's somebody who they don't understand what's going on. They don't understand what they're talking about. They haven't really thought about these things. It's definitely the case that's going on. And just like if somebody, makes a clearly obvious move in chess, it's mate in one, you go, okay, they didn't. It's definitely the case, assuming that they wanted to win the game, that they made the wrong move here. Like it's you can know it. Even if they deny it, it doesn't really matter. At that point, also, it calls into question what the purpose of persuasion is. Like it, for me, because I don't consider myself like my goal in this is not to have people read my work or to it's not public at all. My goal is to discover things for myself and then to try to communicate them in a way that I can, bring people along if they're interested or make money so that I can keep doing my thing. Like if somebody's stuck at the start, then it's not, it's no skin off my back. But that is also the point of square one, where if you make the first steps into inquiring about anything, you in fact are presupposing the distinction between true and false. Do you want to keep talking about that, or
I want to ask one other thing on this, but I do want to get back to logic and existence are inseparable. One thing I want to ask is, so your point's been made, and I'm sure that I can keep playing devil's advocate on it, but I'm sure I would like to get deeper into this, and I can bring out the skeptic whenever I want. Where I want you to sort of answer a little bit more deeply is, do you think that everything you just said applies just to the distinction between truth and falsity, or not just that they're distinguishable, but also that they are exhaustive? That is to say, if somebody has basically what I'm asking is this idea that, if you are talking at all, then you're presupposing truth and falsity. Do you think, would you go as far as to say, if you're talking at all, then you're presupposing essentially the law of excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the law of the excluded middle, because that's sometimes a little bit fuzzier, just the way that people communicated about it. I think in the way that I communicated about it in my book, yes, my claim is definitely that if you're engaging whatsoever, you're actually presupposing the law of identity and non-contradiction and the fact that logic and existence are inseparable, all in the same bundle. There's a line there where it says something like, logic, existence, truth, and falsehood are all bundled into the same thing. That's the truth. That is the inescapable thing that we are necessarily presupposing in order to even do what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's clear. Tell me about logic and existence being inseparable.
Okay, so we're at truth and falsehood. So if it's the case that we made it this far, it is the case that there is a meaningful distinction between what is true and what is not true. Well, if you think about that distinction, what is the essence of the distinction between true and not true? There's several ways of talking about it, but I would say the essence is negation. That what we mean by true is something being the case, and what we mean by not true is explicitly not being the case, negating whatever is being affirmed. So the very concept of truth and falsehood implies a fundamental, meaningful relationship, a kind of mutual exclusivity between what is the case and what is not the case. Because if somebody were to say what is not the case is the case, it would say, no, you don't understand. There's a reason why we have this special word not, and it's to say not, right? It is negation. That's the whole point of the meaning of the word. And if you do that, if you grant that, okay, what is the case, what is not the case, that is the law of identity. It is the same thing as the law of non-contradiction. So to say what is the case is not the case is to be confused about how we use language. And that's another way of saying it is not the case that there could ever be such a thing as a logical contradiction, that all cases of logical contradiction are linguistic errors, and it must be the case, because you cannot affirm and negate at the same time, and it still makes sense. Oh, yeah, right. So that gets to logic and existence. So the question is, why is that the case? If we get to this point where we accept truth and falsehood, that gets us to affirmation and negation. We go, well, why? Why couldn't it be the case that something is and isn't? I think it's true. A correct response is to say, well, it just must be that way. That's true. It must be that way. That the whole reason we're saying those words is it must be that way. Why must it be that way? And this is what I'm saying is the most fundamental idea in all of philosophy. It's because identity and logic, non-contradiction, the rules of logic are inescapable from all of existence. If you're talking about anything whatsoever, that is the thing that you're talking about. Which also means that if you're not talking about that thing, you are not talking about that thing. So literally for every single thing, by virtue of it being a thing, it has identity, which means it must be opposed from negation. So at the bottom of everything, That is why logic and existence are inseparable. The rules of existence are separate from existence itself. And therefore, you can know in every circumstance in which there is a supposed logical contradiction, there must be some error going on, which is a really interesting perspective to take, because if that's not, that's not self-evident to a lot of people, but when you start examining paradoxes, you start knowing the answer. So like if there's some new paradox I've never seen before, I literally already know the answer before investigating it. It's remarkable. And every single time you find the problem or many candidate problems that are there. So did that explain a little bit more what I mean by just how inescapable logic and identity is from existence?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's actually pretty clear. I think I understand it better than I have before. And it seems to me like what you're saying is the moment you are talking about anything, you're assuming that it exists in some way, whether it is as a concept or as a description or as a thing or whatever it is, right? You're already, the moment you're talking about anything, you've granted existence. And basically you're saying with existence come the laws of logic. And so you can't actually talk about anything without the laws of logic being involved.
Yes. And so that's almost all of it. So you're talking about existence, which means you're not talking about non-existence. So you have identity and you have non-contradiction. But there's one more piece of the puzzle here, which isn't in square one, but it's in my next book, and it's about metaphysics. Because what if the skeptic says, what if there is nothing? Maybe it's the case that there is no existence. If we grant that logic and existence are inseparable because things have to be the way they are and they aren't the way they aren't, and that's what we mean by everything, maybe there aren't things. I think that if you want to take a skeptical approach, that is a question you have to examine. Could it be the case then, if we want to escape the laws of logic, escape the laws of existence, maybe there aren't things? Well, upon meditation, in fact, there are things. If we're careful about what we mean by things, I don't necessarily mean physical objects. At the very least, there are experiences. And the experiences, if you're aware of them, they have boundaries. And if you want to do this cool linguistic thing, what we do is we carve up our experiences in particular ways with particular boundaries. We call those experiences things. So if we do that, it is certainly the case that there are things. So immediately, there are things, and they are the way that they are.
Yeah. So I think where our disagreement lies is probably it's probably honestly in philosophy of language. And I think all of these things are actually really are inseparable. So of course that, you can't just talk about philosophy of language without involving ontology and without involving epistemology. But I think it's pretty fundamentally on the kind of like relationship between language and the world and our minds. So let me, let's see, how can I put this? My view is that to talk about anything, right? You need to presuppose a linguistic framework. You need to actually have language in order to talk about anything and refer to things, right? And basically, where my skepticism tends to come is in noticing that our linguistic frameworks and our linguistic practices, which I think are almost identical with our conceptual frameworks, not exactly, but I think that our conceptual frameworks are so much made of language that the relationship is extremely, extremely close between our linguistic frameworks and our conceptual frameworks. I think that these are human developments that have just kind of developed over time. I tend to give a lot of credence to evolutionary theory, so I tend to think that the way that language has developed over time has tended to be in response to evolutionary imperatives, which means usefulness, basically. And so my view is that since we can only talk about things through a language, I think what we can doubt is the coherence or the potential coherence of our linguistic framework. Maybe linguistic frameworks in general, but certainly of the one that we're actually using. So I think let me bring up the liar paradox. It so often gets involved in these kinds of discussions. I think that I don't have a very strong view on the liar paradox, but so far I'm still sort of lean to a dialethic kind of approach that just accepts, yes, the sentence is both true and false.
And meaningful at the same time?
Yes, and meaningful. And, basically my view is that this is not a particularly fundamental or deep truth. I think what it is a truth about is fundamentally about our linguistic frameworks. That is to say that you take the concepts that have developed over time and evolved over time and used and that we've used for all kinds of different purposes. You can kind of combine parts of them and twist them around in a certain way that leads you to a kind of fork in the road. And one of those forks is basically none of those forks is pretty. Right, none of them is intuitive, but that's just how language has developed. That it's developed in such a way where you can kind of twist it around and create this very special sentence that actually isn't, about anything really substantial. It's actually just about itself, and so it seems to me then that the less costly option in those cases is to accept, in these weird circumstances that don't have particularly strong significance. Let's just say truth and that exclusivity between truth and falsehood that seems so intuitive and seems to apply in the vast majority of cases just doesn't apply.
Okay, that would be true then.
Yes, and that would be true.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Excellent. So unfortunately, I only have about 7 minutes left, but there was lots of things you brought up there that I really want to cover. So the first is about the distinction between the conceptual scheme and the linguistic scheme. I think you and I are similarly composed in our mental structures if you are heavily linguistic in the way that you think about the world. But I'm discovering that, in fact, a lot of people aren't. My wife's a good example. She's very much more visual. So her conceptual scheme is not as tightly woven in with the linguistic scheme, and yet she has very intricate, and it's hard for me to describe because I think in a verbal sense, but like I sometimes even literally think of words when I'm thinking about things. It's very heavily verbal. She just sees it in like visual pictures. But more importantly, language is often about communication between people. I'm not really as interested in communication between people. I want to know if my mind can access concepts that are true or false. If we can communicate, that's great. If we can't, that's fine too. So I'm not going to claim that there's any kind of certain communication between human beings. I don't think that's the case at all. There's all kinds of fundamental murkiness when we get into how our different linguistic schemes work. But that's irrelevant for the question of whether or not there could be a true-false thing in the world. So with the example of the liar, you say it doesn't have big implications. Well, yeah, it has. I mean, what could have bigger implications? If in some circumstance what is the case is not the case, and that's somehow meaningful, well, that's the most important truth or not truth. I'm not exactly sure how to talk about it, that there could be. That in fact, in every other circumstance, things are exactly the way they are, and truth means truth, and falsehood means falsehood, and what is true is not false, and that's what we mean by the term. But in this circumstance, we've arranged words in such a way where what is the case is not the case at the same time, and that's okay. That I find that a stretch. And I don't think it's necessary at all. There's several perfectly fine resolutions to the liar's paradox that say it's a linguistic error that it kind of tricks our minds into thinking it can do something that it can't do, which is entertain the idea of a logical contradiction. But in fact, when you investigate, everything's perfectly fine, just like everything else. Everything gets perfectly resolved. So the question I have for you in the last few minutes is about the meaningfulness of when you say, let's say the liar's paradox is true, and it is not the case that it is true. What does that mean? Well, it's not that at the same time.
Not that the liar paradox is true and false at the same time. That the liar sentence, the liar sentence is true and false at the same time.
What does that mean? It is the case and it is not the case.
Precisely, exactly that.
Okay,
So
well,
that sentence, right? The sentence we're all familiar with. The sentence is false.
okay.
Is is true. It is the case. It's saying something. Basically, so let me put it to you this way, and I think here's why I think the philosophy of language is so important. To me, there's nothing more to language than, if you think about the meaning of a word, right? It's going to have certain conditions regarding whether it applies, right? I think that we can look at language in that way. Like, you want to know if something that you want to say is true. It's not ever any more complicated than, let's look at the meaning of the word. There must be some conditions that tell you if that applies or doesn't, right? And so really all I say is that the conditions for the liar saying something truthful are met, so it is true. And the conditions for saying something false are also met, and so it is false.
But remember what we were saying before about meaning of truth and falsehood. Mm-hmm. What is the meaning of true if it's the case that what is true is not true? You've destroyed the meaning of negation. What you're saying is negation no longer is negation, because you can have negation and affirmation at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, my point is that here is a case where, again, we're led into a situation where we have to say something. And what I'm saying...
No, it's very easy to say that the liar's paradox is a linguistic error that does not imply a logical contradiction. So how about wait, let me ask you, how about we come up with a new type of concept? Let's call it absolute negation. And with absolute negation, what that means is that it cannot be mixed together with affirmation. Okay, so I like to use the word not. That's how language works, is we use the word not in the English language. But do you accept that there is such a way to have that concept of absolute negation, where mutual exclusivity is definitely a full-on thing with no exceptions, and that it would completely destroy the meaning of the word to allow them to mix?
Yeah, and I do think that that's already what the word not is supposed to do. I do agree with you on that.
So you're saying that there are actually exceptions to the word not, that sometimes not doesn't mean not means not and.
What I'm saying is, well, yeah, I guess that is actually what I'm saying, yes.
Okay, that's what I'm saying is, all that means is that it is not the case that you've reflected on this deeply enough, because that does not make sense. If you think about that, if you want to have a clear what we mean by the words that we choose, that does not make sense. I'll give you an example. So I understand the sentence, Billy is taller than Susie. I also understand the sentence, Susie is taller than Billy. Okay? Now, I can put those together and say Billy is taller than Susie and Susie is taller than Billy, and now I've made an absurdity. It doesn't make any sense, because one is an explicit negation of the other. This is what true and false is doing. A, not A, those things are fine. When you say A and not A, the whole thing gets exploded, and it no longer actually makes sense when you affirm and negate.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's clear. Again, my view is that, and my response to that is just that the liar paradox puts us in a situation where we have to accept something extremely counterintuitive. And again, and I know that.
Wait.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is more easier to stomach? The idea that in this one really weird circumstance, everything explodes, and it literally doesn't make sense in the sense that we can't wrap our head around affirmation and negation at the same time, and it being coherent. That's the definition of incoherent, and that we have this one example, this one stick of dynamite in which nothing makes sense anymore, or maybe there's a linguistic thing that can be sorted out with the liar's paradox, which preserves sensibility and rationality and the coherence of the idea of the word not or negation. Like, why would you think that you think that this is inescapable, but it is not inescapable. There's all kinds of resolutions which are perfectly satisfactory and don't involve destroying the meaning of language.
So I think that you've taken some huge steps. So let me be clear on a couple of things. First of all, I do think that this is a huge step to make. If there was a kind of easy solution, I'd be, that had us maybe make a sacrifice, but a smaller one, of course, I'd be happy with it. I haven't found one. I have.
What's the sacrifice with my resolution? But to say that it is that you run into an infinite regress problem, or a problem with incoherence, one or the other.
It means denying the possibility of self-reference.
No, it doesn't. It has self-reference baked right into the whole thing. You can definitely self-refer just in that circumstance, not if it generates an infinite regress.
So do you actually have only, because this is like something that I know that we could talk about for hours. And I think what might be awesome is if we do a follow-up call just on the liar paradox, because I'm pretty sure we could do a full episode's worth and a pretty long one on it. So yeah, I mean, because I always have like one more thing I can say, but.
Well, so this is the small book that I'm working on now. So I only have a small amount of work written on the liar, but that's not reflective of the full fleshing out of the resolution to the liar's paradox. This is why I think it's so unbelievably important. The liar is massively, massively, massively important. But yeah, all the standard objections, what about, this sentence is in English, or this sentence has 5 words, or there's a million different standard objections that I haven't taken the time to go through, and it's all going to be there. And it's crystal clear, no logical contradictions, very, very intuitive, and I don't think you actually have to give up anything other than a very radically different worldview than one which preserves the beauty of everything being logically coherent and airtight. Right? There's a kind of if you allow any paradoxes, if you allow any logical issues, you're going to end up with a completely different system of thought than if one in which you understand logic to be absolute and you understand the reasons for it being absolute. And actually, I would love to, part of the reason I'm in the process of writing this book is because of some of the conversations we had, where I realized, okay, I was a bit ambiguous here when I made this short YouTube video for people who haven't seen it. It uses the word, I think meaningless is the word that I use, and that was kind of a off the cuff, frivolous thing. I was like, okay, I think it came from an article that I wrote, but a lot of people have actually taken that very literally to say that, oh, Steve is saying that self-reference is literally meaningless, as if it's indistinguishable from gibberish, and that's not the case at all. So thank you, because this is obviously something that needs to be resolved, properly. Because if you think that the relationship between logic and existence is important, the liar's paradox is like the biggest challenge to these claims.
Cool. Well, look, I mean, and the other thing is, I think if we discuss the liar more, I think what'll come out more is some of that difference in our view of what logic really is, which we haven't really gotten a chance to get to. And I think, again, if we tried to squeeze it in the next 3 minutes, it would do it a huge disservice. So look, let me follow up with you and let's do that call. I think it would be awesome. I think this has been a fantastic intro to that anyway. Thank you so much for being here. Awesome talking to you as always.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Awesome. Have a good night, man. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I'll be speaking with Professor Catarina Dutil-Novaes about her dialogical account of logic. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work, at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.